Okay, I have to start off this review by just saying that this show has once again proved to me that dwarf and elf friendships are easily the best friendships in all of fiction, and no one can change my mind on that. Like, legitimately, I am living for the Elrond and Durin friendship in this show. They are so adorable and wonderful, and they, like, it honestly hit me in the heart right immediately. Anyways, we will talk about that in a minute, but I had to put that right up front that I just loved all of that. Anyways, hello everyone. I am here to talk about a show that I have been so hotly anticipating and I'm so excited to discuss, and that is Amazon Prime's The Lord of the Rings TV show, The Rings of Power. Like, legitimately, while I do not talk a lot about it on this channel and elsewhere, I am a huge Lord of the Rings nerd. Like, I literally have a Lord of the Rings tattoo on my body that I'm showing you right now, and I'm just a big fan of this series, even though I haven't had much of a chance in recent years to talk about it. So now I can finally, like, release this, like, nerddom that I've been bottling up on this channel for so freaking long, and I'm just very, very pumped to actually show that. Like, legitimately, I know a lot of you also probably feel this way if you're of my generation and around my age, but, like, my dad read me the Hobbit books before I could even read. It was the first thing that I ever, like, got to see as, like, an adult kind of story, even though The Hobbit was a kid's book. And then when I got to see them in film, this was the first time, like, movies were seen to me as, like, they could be cinema, they could be these great works of fiction, of filmmaking, but also be nerdy as well. And then even as I grew up from there, like, if Star Trek was the thing that, like, set the fire in my heart on just being this big giant dork and nerd, Lord of the Rings was the thing that sparked it. Was like that initial, like, putting the like the little, like, embers upon the flame, if I can make the metaphor work in some way, shape, or form, that eventually Star Trek would blow upon and make huge and bright. I'm gonna end that metaphor. Anyways, I will even fight for the Hobbit movies. Well, the first two. The third one, less so. That one gets, that one has a lot of problems. Let's just say Legolas, Mario jumping everywhere. But the first two, while not great movies, I think are just fun little romps in Middle-earth. Again, they're like get drunk and enjoy yourself movie, not like, oh, great works of cinema like the Lord of the Rings movies are. Anywho, all that is being said to say that I am very, very pumped to talk about this show, and let's just dive into it. The first thing that I really want to discuss with this show is what I think that they perfectly captured. And again, I will have criticism of the show. I don't think it's a perfect, like, 10 out of 10. I'm not just going full nerddom on this and just, like, geeking out over it. I do have some criticisms, but the thing that I think is perfectly captured, and something that I think some people who have been discussing this series that I saw reviews of before I watched the show going into tonight, are kind of, I think, miscalculated upon, and this is just my opinion, you can disagree with me, is the tone of this show. I think this series could have very easily been something that kind of fell into how we think about fantasy in terms of our kind of cultural consensus on it in the moment, that has been so influenced by things like Game of Thrones and The House of the Dragon, in that those shows have a very, like, even though they're fantasy, kind of grounded, darker, grittier, more, I want to say, like, interpersonal and really just getting into, like, the human grittiness and interactions of everything. And that's certainly great fiction as well. Like, I love Game of Thrones for most of it, and The House of the Dragon has also been really, really excellent. And then we've also had things like The Witcher, which certainly aren't on that level, but still have that same sort of tone that a lot of, like, science fiction's going for, or sorry, fantasy has been going for. This show could have easily been trying to do that same exact thing. And yet, what I loved about this show is it actually still managed to capture the more, I want to say, just high fantasy feel that Tolkien works, I think, really lend to and bring. And I saw some reviewers and people complaining about the show, and complaining is the wrong word, like good criticism of the show, that were saying that they felt it was a little bit more of generic fantasy. Felt if they took the Lord of the Rings out of it, it would just be a bland or fantasy show. He wanted to say science fiction for some reason. And I understand where that feeling comes from. But I think it forgets that, like, fantasy as, like, a genre that we think of today was basically created by Tolkien. Like, fantasy existed beforehand, and clearly there have been works that have reacted to and against and gone their own ways, like Ursula K. Le Guin Earthsea series is very much its own type of fantasy set from Tolkien. But, like, a lot of what we think of as fantasy comes from Tolkien. And so, when you think of, like, generic fantasy, well, the thing that we think of generic is what Lord of the Rings built upon, and then things like D&D sort of, like, ubiquitized in sort of some sort of, like, standard rules. And then you look at something like Game of Thrones, and that is a its own thing for sure, but also was in part the intention of George R. R. Martin to be a direct reaction against Tolkien's work, to try and say, well, what if I had those type of like events, but had like how people would actually act in like medieval Europe or that sort of thing in those situations. And so there are two shows very much trying to do very different things. And I think the very fact that House of the Dragon and Lord of the Rings, while certainly probably good for the market synergy of it all, is probably doing a disservice to them in terms of the conversation, because I don't think that comparing them directly in terms of like saying one's better or more interesting does either a service. I think it's a great conversation to talk about them in like conversation with each other's works of art, but in terms of like saying one's better than the other, which is a lot of what our conversations in terms of like online discourse with things like setting things against each other, everything has to be in opposition to each other. I think it does both of them a disservice because they're very much doing different things. And I think that this show just really, really captures that high operatic tone, that like high fantasy feel of the series. And yet, especially in episode 2, really brings us into feeling like a little bit more of that personal feel that you want to feel from a show like this. Like, it's not all these high arcing, like big grand operatic things going on, but there is some sort of groundedness to them. But that is sort of more the vibe than you would get from like a House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones. And by the way, I didn't say this earlier. I'm going to go full into spoilers for both of the first 2 episodes of the show. So if you have not seen either of them from here on out, I am going to go full spoilers. So just be self-aware of that going forward. One thing, though, I will say with that in mind, like thinking the tone has been captured, I will say some of the, especially in episode 1's early dialogue, does feel a little bit stilted. There are a couple moments, especially in the very beginning, where we get characters who very much are speaking like in exposition and as you know phrases. Like there's an elf that I think speaks to Galadriel where she's on her mission to try and find Sauron at the beginning of the episode. Who's like, as you know, Galadriel, we have been following you for many a month. And we now are suddenly having these feelings that probably would have been simmering over the past 2 weeks, but I'm now just expressing to you in this very expositional way. Like that kind of had that vibe. Like this dude probably, since he's been traveling with her for a very long time, would not talk to her in this way. And so that there is that sort of like stiltedness in a little bit of it. But I do feel like some of that high language actually fits the show, and especially the characters like Elrond and Galadriel, who I do think later on, when we get to see them in episode 1 interacting with each other and having their conversations between friends, I did see some people saying like, oh, that still also felt a little bit stilted and unrealistic. For me, though, it worked. Because these are elves, right? They do kind of have this holier-than-thou feel to them. Even Galadriel, who's kind of the more kind of down-to-earth, more hardened by the world character, still has that sort of like above-it-all feel. This sort of godlike, for lack of a better word, even though that's not the right word, like pretentious sort of feel to them. And I think that flowery, almost poetic, not fully poetic, but like a little bit more flowery and stilted language fits them really, really well. And it shows to me that this was intentional when we do go over to episode 2 and we get to see the dwarves and things like that, where it is still a little high fantasy. You get dwarves saying like, the hammer, like still speaking very like genericized dwarf terms, if I may use that phrase, I guess. But it feels a little bit more like everyday and more personable than you got between the elves. And so I think that it's a hard choice to jump into, especially after something like the House of the Dragon, but I think it actually works for what this show is intending. And I actually really, really love it. Moving forward, though, I actually really love the way that this show deals with its themes. Let's start with Galadriel first. Galadriel, I think she is great throughout all of this. I love that this show, kind of in comparison to House of the Dragon, like House of the Dragon is very much directly dealing with, again, I don't want to compare too much, but just to elucidate this point here, is a show that's dealing very much with like a patriarchal world and talking about like a lot of those ideas that we're sort of dealing with like patriarchy and women's place in it within that show. Whereas here, clearly there's men in power in certain respects, and patriarchy is certainly still a thing in Middle Earth, but it's less so, especially in the elves. And I like Galadriel getting to be in this like badass woman place that doesn't really feel like it's coming down to gender in any way, shape, or form. Like there's no real talk of that or discussion of that. And I kind of like that as sort of a refreshing counterbalance to something that we've seen in the House of with the dragon. But I also really love how they set up her character. Again, very operatic way. She has this idea like, how do we know if we're running towards or away from something? This sort of like boat metaphor that runs throughout the first episode about her being unsure whether she should follow the light or whether she should return to Middle Earth, whether she believes that she should chase Sauron or not. And there's this constant discussion of like, is she hyper focused on this problem of Sauron and not letting herself and also the world around her enjoy the peace that's there by just like trying to eliminate every piece of evil without like letting people just get to live their lives after like this long part of war? But also she could be right. And we even get a repetition of that in episode 2 where we meet the handsome man dude who I forget his name so far, but like handsome man dude is the only one that survives on that shipwreck, which like of course I literally saw him like, of course it's the handsome one that lives, which I thought was funny. But anyways, where he sort of says something like, I haven't really decided if you're running away or running towards something. And I don't think she knows either. Is she running away from the promised lands, the heavenly world that she wants to go to? Is she running away from that? Or is she running towards Sauron and trying to stop him? Like, what is she so hurt by her trauma that she's not allowing herself to find peace? She's not allowing herself to heal, that she's just stuck in that re-experiencing of her trauma that was caused by the deaths that she saw in her brother. And this is a show kind of about that. Like, is this a show sort of like her moving past her trauma about that? Or is it something where she actually does have a point to be like, we need to try to fight and push back against this evil that is Sauron? And I think both actual discussions are equally valid and an interesting place to put her character. And I think they really balance that extremely well in again, these very high operatic, like grandiose stakes. And I just really, really loved that. And I have to say, in many ways, that's kind of what the series itself is about. Is Middle-earth able to recover from its trauma of its past after Morgoth and Sauron's initial basically destroying of this land and just sort of setting people against people and the prejudices that exist, the things, the memories that people remember for generations past that we get to see with the elves? Like, this idea of, are we moving forward or are we stuck in our traumas and our pain of just remembering things in the past? I think is just a central theme of this show that we are starting to see drawn out within these first few episodes. And I think that that's honestly a fantastic discussion for this show to dive into. Because it's basically talking about both personal trauma and generational and cultural and intercultural traumas as well, and power relationships and dynamics. The other thing, too, that I am loving with this show is I am loving some of the mysteries that it's having, even for Tolkien fans. Because we have this meteor man, right? Who lands at the end of episode 1. And I've seen a lot of speculation online that this character is Sauron. And again, I don't know either way. So I'm not spoiling for anybody. But there's been speculation that he is Sauron. And I think the show wants you to speculate on this. And like, is he pretending to be this meteor man to make people like start to worship him? Like, Sauron is a trickster. He could easily try to trick people into thinking that he's a god that fell from heaven in order to make them worship him and build up a following after he lost so much. But it also could be something like Gandalf. There's clearly hints towards it being Gandalf with him speaking to the Fireflies as well. But then the Fireflies die, which is a very like Sauron-y thing. And clearly, if it's Gandalf, that does mess with Lord of the Rings canon a tad bit, because Gandalf doesn't supposedly come until much later than this in the timeline. But I honestly kind of like them playing with that expectation a little bit, because this series, Lord of the Rings, at this time in the setting that they're setting it, is very much, I know they're drawing from the appendices from The Hobbit, but even if they were drawing from even more literal things like the Silmarillion, which they aren't legally allowed to, but even if they were, that is very much broad stroke stuff. It's like, this happened, and then 1,000 years later, this happened, and then 1,000 years later, this happened. And so it's not very like beat by beat a story. And so there's a lot of room for interpretation within those, and a lot of like wiggle room for discussion on that. And so I just love that they're able to like do all these things like, oh, here's Celeborn, the guy who, well, I won't spoil for you if you don't know who Celeborn is, but like if you're a Tolkien nerd, you're like, oh, I know who Celeborn is. Like, I know that guy. I know what he's eventually going to do and what's going to happen to him. So we have him and things like that, and Elrond and Galadriel. But then you also have these like things where you're like, I actually don't know what's going on here. I'm kind of intrigued. I'm kind of curious. And so I like that they're able to play that mystery back and forth and have me guessing, like, I'm not sure who this meteor man is. And then it has me wondering, well, if that's not Sauron, who else would it be? Is it handsome man that saves Galadriel, which would also be a great twist. Like, if that's Sauron, like, Galadriel will then eventually be traveling with the very dude who turns out to be the one that she's been wanting to hunt for a very long time. And if he's Sauron, then who is Meteor Man? Is he Gandalf? Was that break canon? Is there other things that he could be? So many interesting questions that I think that mystery is walking the line of that I really deeply enjoy. Going even further, though, I joked about it earlier, but I have to say, Elrond and Durin together were just so great. Like, first off, getting to see Khadum, the Mines of Moria, in their full, like, their prime, was so awesome. I'm like, oh my god, this is where the Balrog's gonna be. This is where Gandalf's gonna do the whole thing, like, you shall not pass. And I'm like, oh god, it's so cool. Just seeing that was awesome. But then, like, everything with Elrond and Durin was, oh, I loved it so much. It brought back the best moments between Legolas and Gimli, and they managed to evoke that in such a short time. Like, clearly they are not like John Rhys-Davies and Orlando Bloom here. Like, top of their actors in the top of their, like, acting game in those films. But it evokes that and still manages to make me feel for them in a really lovely way. Like that scene where Durin literally says, like, I lived a life. And you can see that he's very hurt. And you can understand, like, for Elrond, it's like, oh, 20 years is nothing to me, but I forgot you're mortal. And you could see the pain in his character, and you feel for him in that short bit, but you also still sense that he cares for him, and you get those, like, little moments where you realize that, like, the sapling that Elrond gave him, he's been cherishing and nurturing, and then his wife and his kids just, like, being like, oh, stay for supper and everything. Like, it was so wonderful. I'm just sitting here like, oh my god, just kiss, you two. It's like the wife. I know, I'm having fun. Don't worry. I'm not ruining the importance of male friendships, of course. But I'm just like, the wife is just literally like, oh, I kind of should leave. These two need to make out and work some stuff out. But clearly, like, legitimately, I think it's a very interesting friendship that they managed to evoke in a short time. Again, not on the level of Legolas and Gimli, but aiming in that direction and giving me a lot of that same feel in such a short time. And it does it really, really well. And I think the show needed that. Needed something less, like, high and mighty and grand sweeping, like, tale, and grounded a little bit in something more like that. And I think by having that, it lends a lot more weight to the rest of the stuff going on, where you have this more personable friendship despite the high and mighty things going on. That being said, I do have some criticisms. The stuff going on, and I can't even remember the names because of how generic they are. But the human woman with the kid who, like, has the sword, the, like, Sauron sword that he finds that, like, works with blood magic, and I'm like, kid, anything that works with blood magic, not a good deal. Don't do it. Just don't deal with it. It's a bad move. And then the, like, one elf who's, like, in love with her. And there's, like, the star-crossed lovers thing going on. It's not bad by any means. I think it's fine, but I wasn't really particularly drawn to that in particular throughout the story. It kind of felt like a little bit more paint by the numbers. Hence, given the fact that I don't really remember their names yet, again, it's not bad, and I can see it working eventually, and if you give me a little bit more to work with these characters. But right now, they do feel a little bit too impersonal as people, though we do get small moments of them sort of crossing cultural boundaries between the two of them. Again, a very, like, star-crossed lovers sort of thing. But it doesn't work as well for me as it could have if they just given them a little bit more time to cook as characters, I think. But we'll see if that over the course of the next few episodes. A few other things, just random little bits here and there that I do want to toss out and discuss. The craft on this, I mean, they spent a frack ton of money on this show. I think it's cost more than when adjusted for inflation than the Lord of the Rings movies themselves cost, which is damn. For 8 hours of TV versus 9 hours of movie, which an interesting sort of thing, or like 12 hours if you consider all the extended cut stuff. So they got more money to do in less time with, which you can clearly see it though, because the craft on this is gorgeous, and it feels like, I don't want to say a perfect middle ground between Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but Lord of the Rings, I think, still is the high bar for just practical effects in movies. You can get stuff with Christopher Nolan, but like the Lord of the Rings films are like, they made every piece of armor have its own scratches and buffs and have its own individual personality. And you get to see so much of it in that movie. And then you go to The Hobbit, which again, I still find fun movies, but they are overstuffed with CGI and everything looks plasticky and kind of bland and too green screened in a lot of senses. Like the big grand vistas still feel very green screened. But here in this show, I don't think it reaches the level of the Lord of the Rings movies in terms of like every piece of armor having like a personality. But some of the shots and craft in this show are gorgeous. Even when it does sort of mix in more CGI elements than the Lord of the Rings films did, it is beautiful. And that also comes down to like the creature design, like the orcs in this are actually creepy and scary. Like that one scene with the orc coming into the girl's house, and it's sort of like a little bit of a horror scene. Well, not the scariest thing I've ever seen. The very fact that they made one orc, creepy and disgusting, and mildly terrifying was awesome. And the build up to them too, with the orcs, like we see the scratches on the wall and the nail. This the one elf like underwater and in a cave, which by the way is like a big mix of my own personal like fears, like underwater and cave horror. Whew! It wasn't the scariest version of that, but this show was touching upon it. And they also did underwater horror with Galadriel facing the sea beast, the like underwater dragon worm, which was also very cool. So they were touching upon my fears. They weren't the scariest that I've ever seen, but they were getting there, and I did enjoy that. But the build up to the orc with like the elf getting pulled into the dark, and all that stuff was really great, effective build up, and the creature design and the look and feel were all fantastic. But everyone's armor as well, like particularly the one elf who I was just talking about, again, the generic elf, I forget his name, but his like wood armor looked very, very cool. The beauty of so many different shots was also really wonderful. Again, the creatures and stuff, just the craft on display was truly excellent. Not necessarily in my mind at the level of the Lord of the Rings movies, but certainly getting there. And that's impressive for a TV show. So yeah, I think that's pretty much everything that I had to say on these episodes, not movies, on these episodes. Really great. I found them to be not perfect. I do have things here and there. And certainly I do also feel that a lot of your enjoyment of this versus something like The House of the Dragon will come down to personal preference versus what type of fantasy you enjoy. Personally, I enjoy both. But for me, I was very pleased. As someone who has loved Lord of the Rings for a long time, but never felt the high of those movies since. This came as close to them as I have ever felt. I don't know if we'll ever recapture that again. The Hobbit movie certainly tried. This show will certainly try. I don't think it will recapture that, but it's certainly touching upon that feeling. And for that, I got to give it a high bar. I got to give it like, this was great. This was fun. I enjoyed it, and I'm very excited for more. So that's my thoughts on Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. What did you think about these two episodes? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. Don't forget, I'll be reviewing more of She-Hulk, as well as The House of the Dragon, as well as Star Trek Lower Decks, as well as Andor when it comes out in a few weeks. So there's a lot of shows I'm reviewing on this channel. So be on the lookout for all of those. But beyond all of that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.